Hey guys, you're listening to Rome Recap Episode 2. If you listened to our last one, you'll know that we covered quite a lot of areas, and this week we'll do exactly the same, just different areas. A lot of this podcast is to do with skill performance, which we'll go into more detail with our next book podcast, Peak by Anders Ericson and Robert Poole. A lot of it's to do with deliberate practice, different angle thinking, subjective experience, and mental representation. Outside of the book Peak, we also talk about categorising, expertise, how an expert's opinion of something can be completely different from a novice's or a rookie's. We also talk about imagination and reality, as well as creative outlooks. So if any of that sounds interesting, make sure you give it a listen and make sure you leave a comment or a review if you feel so. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy. Hello listeners, you are listening to the Wise Words Rome Recap podcast. Rome Research is a note-taking tool for networking thought. Both myself and Jes use it, and so we have decided to review some of our weekly notes that you may not have heard of in our book review episodes. So if you like what you hear, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you have any thoughts of your own on any of the multiple subjects we talk about, why not leave us a comment or send us a DM to our Instagram at WiseWordsBlog. Until then, enjoy. All right, so Rome Recap 2. Do you want to start us off, Jes?
Did you want to touch on stuff like peak and improvement? If it's just going to narrow this down a little bit, or
I've got some aspects from peak.
Let's put it this way. You told me you were seeing you had quite a few insights this week, and I kind of wanted to just explore that maybe.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, one of the main things that I kind of took from it was this aspect that, you know, when we were at school and like everyone says like 10,000 hours, but it's really not about just putting time into it.
Sure.
But I think we tend to like define things or measure things by just time rather than quality of time. And I liked the fact that like in Peak, he kind of described like anything is possible. You just need to find a new way of getting around it, a new hurdle.
Yeah.
And that like we should measure things in kind of like almost like obstacles, because you can't get to obstacle 10 without passing obstacle 1. So it doesn't matter how much time you put into something.
Sure.
It's all about like using that kind of metric rather than time, because time, we kind of have this idea that like progress is inclination, like we're constantly climbing, we're constantly getting better, and time
almost
is like
progress is linked to I get it. Progress
exactly
is time, yeah.
And so it gives us the illusion as if we are improving, rather than actually it's like, well, actually I've been at the same point for 6 months doing this skill, doing this task, and I haven't improved. Sure. You know, we have to kind of like use a different metric that's like, okay, well, what hurdle am I at now? And how do I get around that to the
next? I think another way of thinking of that as well is like this idea of fundamentals v the sort of the sort of expertise, where like if you can spend 10,000 hours on the fundamentals, I think it was Bruce Lee who said like he always just practiced the basics, and he was scared of people who were very good at the fundamentals, because for example you could put 10 hours of practice in and you could skip like, you know, the fundamentals and try and move on to the harder stuff without truly improving. And I think he mentions this later on in the book. He said like the idea of this is like the whole 10,000 hours practice is basically the classic thing that we have a desire to understand a simple cause and effect for like what makes somebody an expert. Okay, easy, it's 10,000 hours, right? It just fills that gap of like trying to explain something simply, when actually it's not really. Like obviously there was that, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell popularized it, wasn't it? Like I can't remember what the book's called, but he basically came up with this 10,000 hour rule. But like you're saying, if you just attach, oh right, I got to do 10,000 hours of this practice here, and then I'm going to be a professional. It just doesn't work like time equals output, you know. Yeah. Like you said, you have to be going through these levels and finding the hurdles and overcoming the hurdles. Like if you're playing tennis, oh fine, you put 10,000 hours of practice into your bloody forehand. What's your backhand going to look like, right?
Exactly.
You still have to go and like actually be smart with your practice, which I think was one of the main things about it. It was overcoming the barriers or what you need to work on, right? Because everybody loves to practice stuff they're good at, but actually the people who don't do the best are the ones who practice at what they're worst at and bring that up to a good standard.
No, exactly. And I think it constantly ties into like, you know, all these kind of habit books and things like that, like Atomic Habits, they don't focus so much on the product, focus on the process. Because when you do that, then you realize that it's more about, oh, which hurdle which hurdle am I at now, and how do I get around that? What's a new method that I can come up with? And I like that aspect of the book in terms of like, you can't use the same method that you use at the beginning, like for, step 10. You might need to just come up with a completely new method, and it's all about like trying to figure out these different methods that help you at that point that you're at.
I think he almost calls them as well, doesn't he? He kind of refers to these methods as like mental processes, like
Yeah.
your body. So you slowly improve your mental processes to deal with like the new sort of standard you're at. Um, he also talks about as well, which is kind of what I was saying second here, is like if you do the same thing again and again, eventually you end up into like the automation zone. And I don't know if you got to this bit, but it talks about how when, let's just say you're practicing, right, and you're not really thinking about it, you're just in automatic mode. You're not actually learning. Like
Yeah, you stagnate.
you need to be outside of your automatic zone. You need to be thinking about how you're doing it because that's the way you can improve your performance. And then you need to be obviously repeating that thinking and trying to sort of connect well. For example, tennis, I guess the example was like thinking about, I don't know, timing, etc., and you're being conscious of how well you're timing things, right? And then over time,
Yeah.
if you keep practicing like that, you start realizing you're getting the timing better and better, and that's when the automation takes over and makes it automatic to hit it better. If you get me,
Yeah.
But if you just play without thinking through, like, oh, what timing am I doing this time? You're not actually really practicing. I think that's quite interesting how he said that's not real practicing. It's like he calls naive is purposeful practicing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I mean, we've kind of actually, by the way, we've just kind of gone into like a peak review here.
I know. That's why it's dangerous, because you'll end up just summarizing the whole book. But yeah, I was just basically just kind of, I liked this idea of having a new metric rather than just time, because people just like, you see all these kind of, big shots, and when they're doing their, university, like, speeches at the end, and they do all these motivational speeches, all it is like put in the hard work, put in like the time. But it's like, I think people get misled that like, no matter how much time you put in, it's got to be like smart time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like smart thinking, smart problem solving. We should use the metric of problem solving rather than time to like kind of
so I think that
get from A to B.
That leads quite nicely into, I've just basically gone to my room and searched measurement.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any sort of stuff for it. So,
well, go ahead, and then I might indeed.
So from one of the books I was reading called Upstream, which is all about problem solving, he talks about the difference between data for learning versus data for inspection. I know this is kind of different.
Okay.
To hear me out. So he talks about like data's for the purpose of inspection. It's a bit like management. It's like, did you hit your sales targets or whatever? Whereas data for the purpose of learning is like data which is going to help you improve. So it'd be more like, like delving deeper into just like not just sales targets. So basically, the way I see it is what you measure defines like the way you sort of deal with that data. So like big to what you're kind of saying, like you could measure on time that you put into it, but that's more inspection, isn't it? It's more like, have I hit the quota of 2 hours a week?
Yeah.
Whereas data for the purpose of learning is how many good forehands did I hit? So it's more specific. It's data based on the thing you're trying to improve rather than something that you're just trying to see if you're hitting a quota.
That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of like, you're also working kind of on the transferableness.
Okay.
Like going back to what you were saying in terms of like, when you're working on the fundamentals, it's like the more generalized areas that are the foundation of whatever you're learning. And so like you work on those transferable areas, and then you can go off and specialize into other areas. I know that's kind of a detail of what you were saying, but in terms of like you were saying, there's, what was it? The data, what were the two ones? The data
for like learning and improvement versus data for inspection. Like there's two different types.
Yeah, exactly. The learning and improvement helps you for the longer run, and it like constantly gets better and better. Whereas the other one is like almost like a check-in period. It's like, where am I at the moment? Oh, okay, this is how many sales I've done right now.
Correct. It's like a check-in process, but it's also like what are you quantifying with that? I guess you're quantifying process. Are you? Yeah, I guess you are. Because like, for example, on the hour thing, you'd be quantifying the amount of times you've spent playing. I'm just trying to link it between the two, because I think there's quite interesting this idea that what you measure actually can influence the way you sort of practice as well.
Yeah. Oh,
Because I think it's
absolutely.
the main point. Like what you measure actually influences the way you behave because you're always trying to optimize the measurement. So like if
Yeah.
you're optimizing, like you said, for the 10,000 hours, you're optimizing then to be playing as much as possible without realizing that just because you've done 10 hours of practice every week doesn't mean you're getting any better if you're sticking to the same.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
maybe you should like in fact, you know, maybe this is the best way of saying it. Like you should measure that, but you should also have some sub measurements which make the most out of those hours. If you kind of so you have the measurement of hours, obviously you want to be practicing a certain amount of time, but you should have some sub measurements within that to actually to gauge improvement or to try and
Yeah.
um,
Well, I think we've said this in terms of like setting up our room, in terms of like, oh, you have a goal and there's like a big goal, right? But then you focus on the process, but you kind of need something to like to jog your memory or nudge you as to why you're doing the goal in the first place. Because sometimes you can just be like, okay, I do this every day, and you kind of lose the motivation for it, and that's why you can look up and see the bigger goal and be like, okay, that's why I'm doing it. Do you know what I mean? So you kind of have your check-in periods to be like, okay, so I'm like smashing this, and then okay, this is how far I've got, and then you get back to like the process at hand.
I think an interesting thing about what you're saying as well is like I think of actually this like this. Are you saying sort of like sub goals? Sorry, like having like different levels,
Yeah,
like different levels.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay. I think also sub goals and all this idea of like measuring different areas of your life, whether it be improving in tennis or whatever, is quite interesting because it gives you different like views of you. Like it gives you different views of what you're doing. So like one of them's giving you views of timing, but one of them's giving you views of progress at a specific thing. And like by having these different sub levels, you have different viewpoints of what you're doing and how you're trying to get there. If you get me,
yeah.
you're not just having this one measurement which you think counts for everything. You're trying to do multiple different things. So you're trying to, you know, there's more to it. It gives you a more multi-dimensional view of looking at it. If you get
Well,
me.
yeah, and I think that's quite interesting because I don't know how many people like see these other ways of looking at their goal.
Mm-hmm.
Or other ways to measure it. Like you just said before, if someone says, okay, you need to do 10,000 hours, then people might just think, okay, well, once I've done the 10,000 hours, I should be an expert. But it doesn't happen like that until someone comes along and then they go like, oh, but you should also look at this aspect of it, this angle of it. And I think like it's kind of interesting that you can have like a goal. Okay, ours is like, building a book summary website, and then someone comes along and be like, have you thought of this way of measuring it as well? And then you kind of incorporate that so that then you can kind of jump from different kind of ways to look at your goal, I guess.
Yeah. No, it makes
Because
sense.
otherwise you end up blinded if like
Well,
you've only got like one way of measuring something and you don't see it from a different angle.
yeah, exactly. And then you start chasing the measurement and you forget what you're trying to do in the first place because you're too busy chasing it. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just to say like, oh, I've done an hour, but it doesn't matter like how shit that hour was, or like how good that hour was.
It's really interesting because it becomes like a scope thing where like you could, yeah, like parents could be measuring their child's like, oh my god, you got to do an hour of practice a day, and if you're not like, you're not. But like, what are they? How good is that practice? There's sometimes when let's just say you're not feeling, you're really tired, right? An hour of practice then is going to do fuck all. Like you're not going to achieve much from that hour of practice. Like sometimes it's better to sort of have flexibility, you know, flexibility in the way you measure things and flexibility in the way you
Adapt.
do things. Yeah, adaptability.
Adapt to the situation. It's I think James Clear talks about it in Atomic Habits, where like you don't want the idea of measuring the habit as in like ticking off you went to the gym, the sole reason for going to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, I've ticked it off, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want that to be the way that like you measure things. You want to be able to like that can show you your progress, but it's not the only reason why you're doing it.
Of course, but also it can show your progress, but also at the same time it doesn't tell you whether that gym session was any good.
Exactly. And how you measure quality is quite hard, but like
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's put it this way: it gets complicated, but I feel like maybe what the main point of what we're trying to sort of get at here is like just optimizing for one, or just using one metric to like measure your life or measure progress and measure yourself is not a good way of doing it. Like you got to have multiple ways of measuring how you're doing things, what you're doing, etc., what your goals are, right?
Yeah.
So if you only have one metric, then it's like if you optimize for that, then you're going to miss out on all the other things.
Yeah. No, precisely.
I've got a quote here. I just searched up practice on my Roam. Thomas Sterner. So I don't know where the hell I pulled this from because I don't even recognize the name. But
Thomas Sterner.
Thomas Sterner. I'm going to press him now. I only got one thing. I must have grabbed it from Twitter or something. So
yeah.
It says everything in life worth achieving requires practice. In fact, life itself is nothing more than one long practice session, and then this effort of refining our motions. When the proper mechanics of practicing are understood, the task of learning something new becomes a stress-free experience of joy and calmness, a process which settles all areas in life and provides proper perspective on all life's difficulties. I quite like this idea because the more I think about it, like when you when you understand that practice is more like looking for where you can improve, you,
Yeah.
I think, in fact, do you know what this is? Here we go. I think this is later on in the book, which I don't know if I want to ruin it for you. But he talks about this idea of like a practice-driven mindset.
Okay.
Let me quickly grab it. So like this, so what this guy was alluding to on his sort of quote there was this idea that once you realize that everything is one big practice, you can make a game out of everything, and this actually links back to flow.
Yeah. Yes, I thought that there was a big link between the two.
Because you get into that flow state of like it's a bit of a challenge and you're engaged, right? And this is the practice driven mindset is like that you're always looking to seek to hone your skills, and you can look to hone your skills in other ways. So let's just say you realize in football you need to be fitter, right? You could hone your skills by going for a jog. You could hone your skills doing other things, like other
Yeah,
activities.
yeah,
So
yeah.
let's just say you were like a builder or something, and you're doing lots of physical activity. You could be honing your strength skills for doing other other sports. And
Yeah, yeah,
what
yeah,
his
yeah,
point was like,
absolutely.
you can bring into other activities the practice that you want for another activity. Similar to like, I don't know, for example, gymnastics might need an extra level of stretching. You could stretch throughout the day. And there is elements of practice that you can fit into your day at
But
all times.
those are the transferable aspects. It's like the
Yeah.
flexibility, the fitness. It's like, you start to see a lot of Olympic athletes that do different things. I think I was watching an interview of like a couple of swimmers from the US team, and they were saying like, oh, well, we do ballet and we do this and we do that, because it's like you're grabbing from so many different areas that, yes, in themselves are specialties, but the underlying concept is, okay, flexibility. You can get that by being a dancer. You can get that by being loads of different things. And I think we talked about this roughly in terms of positive reinforcements. It's like the more things you have to fall back on. Let's say I don't want to go to the gym, but I'm happy to play football.
Mm-hmm.
You're still ticking off that fitness aspect, and they're still doing those other areas. It's just in different contexts.
I'll tell you what's quite an interesting idea as well. So, like, obviously, when I first alluded to what I was saying then was like, well, how can you use the practice driven mindset to hone general skills to, like, like I said, you could do a bit of fitness in another activity to benefit your football skills. But also, I like this idea he talks about, like, looking for opportunities in the day. Let's just say if you're working a boring job, to transform
Yeah,
into practice activities. So he'd be like, right,
yeah,
so let's say every day you have to do the same task again and again and again. He's like, right, think about what that task needs in it, like the steps, and figure out how to improve or practice doing those steps quicker. Is there any other way you can do it? And like, I quite like this idea, and this is like the flow thing. It's kind of like making a
how
game.
can you challenge?
Because when you practice, you're essentially making a game. Because the whole idea of the practice is you set like a goal, a specific thing
Yeah,
you can improve at, and then you head after it. So it's
yeah,
pretty fulfilling to do it. So this idea of like breaking down your day to day activities, it could even be like something really as basic as like, oh, okay, I replied to 5 emails yesterday. Can I reply to 7 or 8 today?
yeah,
Using a new
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
technique or using a new way of speeding up my process. Can I use, for example, there's things called, what is it? Not like keyboard shortcuts is another word for text expander. That's it. There's like an app where you can like put in certain like letters in a row and press enter, and it'll change to like a beginning of a text. Like you could use stuff
yeah,
like that to improve your ability to send stuff quicker. Like basically, it's almost like an inspired person's game. If you can figure out how to make practice like a daily thing for you and improve at what you're already doing. Like
yeah.
let's say I don't know, you're a social media marketer. You should use like you should be thinking about how to like measure what you're doing and how you can practice to improve it. That type of thing.
And that in itself is like a way of looking at things that you can then improve. It's basically a skill in itself, to like look at things that you're already doing, see how you're doing them, and then like implement or create a habit that pushes it, that like makes it a bit more challenging, just a tiny bit for you to like push it. And then like, you're constantly pushing up that cap, that ceiling, that glass ceiling that you're trying to get to. Which I found kind of nuts in terms of like obviously I'm like a big fan of the idea of like adaptability and like you can constantly adapt to whatever, but it was kind of Pete kind of like shone a light on the fact that pretty much anything can be made better and you can adapt to. And then I was thinking, like, this is a bit of a segue, but like imagination, for example, I wondered if there was any link between imagination and dreaming. And I wonder if you were to like test your imagination to a point where like, I don't know how what the challenges are,
Mm-hmm.
Whether you need more detail. And like they talk a lot about like mental representations. So maybe like the more detail you can imagine, the better, and then it's stronger it gets. And then I was wondering whether that leaks into like dreaming, whether your dreams end up getting better because you're like kind of working on your imagination? I don't know, but it'd be quite interesting to find out, I think.
Did you make any notes of that?
Well, it was more just like, I don't know. It was just like, I don't know whether, like, you can sit down, you can imagine anything. If you're in front of your laptop, you can imagine it turning into some weird transformer and dancing around the room. But it's not with like pristine detail. And then I wondered whether you could get to a point where you've like trained your imagination so well that you can kind of just snap into a kind of alternative reality or like fantasy where you can just like conjure up an image and it's like so prominent. And then I was like, I've thinking about like physicists like Albert Einstein, what he would have had to imagine for like this to happen and that to happen and all these kind of different concepts. I wonder what like someone who's like incredibly trained in the art of imagination, what it would look like for them.
Trained in the art of imagination.
Well, I don't know, because it's a weird concept, but like if you're thinking that like you imagine something, right? And we're talking neuroplasticity, the more you do something, the more like, easier it becomes for your neurons to like, spark and everything like that. Then surely imagining something is also, you're doing something. I don't know how you get better at it, or I don't know what the challenges are, but
interesting. I don't know whether you can actually get better imagining. I think it's
I don't know.
I think actually, well, my hunch would be with the Einstein stuff is he had a lot of concepts in his head, and his imagination was a lot of trying to bring concepts together.
Yeah.
And maybe you can train imagination. Don't get me wrong. It's more like do you sit there and do you mull over like a concept, right? For example, like what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Do you mull it over and then let your subconscious just sort of like try and figure out what you're asking and like try and mold together something? That for me is training your imagination, or like training your creativity almost. Is like, can I put two concepts together, or can I try and synthesize some new knowledge from these two different ideas?
Which is basically creativity at the end of the day.
It is, yeah. But I feel like that's because imagination is a tool for creativity in my head, really.
Yeah.
But it's also a tool for fear.
And it's such like it's such a broad like topic. Like it probably encompasses so many aspects. But what's kind of interesting is that you would have, like when they talk about mental representations and how the more you do something, the more clear it becomes, the more clarity, the more like specific detail you can imagine. So then I wonder if that in itself, when you imagine something, it's more detailed, it's more clarity. So no matter whatever skill you apply yourself to, you can conjure up clearer mental representations than you would have.
I mean, you make an interesting point, only because of I remember hearing a study. I can't remember where it's from, which book, but it was this idea that you can actually mentally prepare for events, or you can mentally practice stuff in your sleep, and your body actually will respond as if you've trained.
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe I really don't know, to be honest, mate. I want to say a weird one for me that I found recently, specifically with tennis, is I've been playing quite a bit recently, not too much, right? Yeah. I always find now when I pick up a racket after maybe like a week's break, I'm genuinely better than when I last picked one up, and I almost feel like there's some level of like if you play every day, you're almost overthinking it. Maybe it's because I'm relaxing more, but I don't know. There's something that's calming about like picking something up after like giving yourself a little break from something for a couple of days and then picking it up again. Then training every single day, but I don't know if that goes against the whole peak thing, and I don't really. Maybe that's just like a personal anecdote, which doesn't really. And also, once again, I'm not measuring. Like that's one of the things as well, right? I could say I feel like I'm playing better tennis, but objectively, if somebody was watching me, they could be like, "Fuck, he's no better than he was before. If anything, he's worse." Right?
True. But I think you have to be able to internalize it. Like they do talk about, how there is this relationship or symbiosis between, your mental representation and then your experience. You conjure up an image of what you're supposed to look like when you do a forehand, and then you play the forehand and be like, actually, that felt really good, and that's how I should do it. And then your mental representation is like refined, and then that's what you try and aim for until you play it again, and then you realize, okay, that's a good aspect that I need to do.
I think especially with tennis and stuff like that, the actual mental representation comes from the dopamine hit when you realize you hit a good shot.
Yeah.
Like you refine your representations by like the feedback loops of wow, that was a good shot, and your brain gives you a bit of pleasure, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of when you know you've done something good, and it's almost like repeat it if you kind of get
Yeah.
right
Yeah. Yeah.
that sort of thing. Um, but yeah, mate, it's interesting about this whole idea of like training your mental representations and can you train for imagination? I guess
Yeah. I don't. Yeah.
training for imagination would just be imagination, like imaginating more, like using your imagination more,
Yeah.
having the time every day to sit there and just just think, let your mind sort of run wild.
Well, I kind of do that like now and then with. It sounds weird, but like with book titles or song like album covers or random shit, I just like randomly. It's normally when I'm a bit high, but when you kind of have to like conjure up a story about something random. So you've got nothing to go off apart from one, like the title or the look of the album cover. And you just have to conjure up because there's no right or wrong. You just like, have to be like, okay, well, this is the person that made it and this is what he was going through or this is what happened. You know, and it's so like bizarre, but you're painting an image of how it got around to that. I don't know whether that like helps or not, but yeah.
Well, do you know what? I think interestingly that would help you flex your thinking muscles. Like the idea of like, for example, we look around, we sort of see a book title like this or an album cover, like you're saying, and you look at it immediately and you sort of make a snap judgment, but you don't really think about
Yeah.
it. You just make a judgment and you've already just had this emotional reaction or whatever you've had to it. But you don't really take a second thought to think, actually, hang on a second, somebody chose that to be there. What was he going through? Like, why has he chosen that
Yeah.
to represent? I quite like the idea of just sitting there and just trying to think a bit more in your day to day because a lot of people just walk around like zombies, not thinking, not not
Yeah. No, exactly.
around them. Because I'm actually sure people who do this album artwork actually spend their whole days researching what's best to do, and like they put a lot of thought into it, and a lot of people just pick it up and just throw it down without realizing.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I touched on this idea like it's linked to this imagination and reality thing.
Mhm.
I thought I had like another note in terms of what you so when you imagine something, right? So like let's say I come across a dog and that's like the category for me. A category for the dog is like, four legs and it's furry.
Mhm.
Um and then my imagination can take that literal information
Yeah,
and then blow it up, all right? And then it come up with whatever,
sure.
right? And the whole idea of that, I guess, is to I don't know prepare you for any other like circumstance you might come across. But then you might meet another like let's say your first dog that you ever saw was a golden retriever, and then you come across a black lab, and you're
Yeah,
like, okay, well that can also go in that category. So it refines the
yeah.
category, which refines the literal information. And then I was wondering whether that refines how like you imagine your imagination towards
Ah,
that thing.
yeah, it does for sure. Have you heard of the God? I want to say it's George Lakoff, but I'm not 100% sure. He's more metaphors, but
Yeah.
there's this idea of prototypical thinking that the brain operates off prototypes. So, like you, the
Okay.
thing is, you categorize stuff as a prototype. So, if you in your head right now, the dog thing, you have a prototype of what a dog looked like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and you sort of base your imagination off the prototype. Like
Yeah.
you'd base your knowledge of other things as well off this prototype category you have in your brain,
Yeah.
especially visual representations.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
based on your personal experience, right? So everybody's prototypes are kind of different. But I get what you mean, which is really interesting, by the way, because they talk about how one of the things artists like to do is they take like prototypes and then they just explore prototypes and how they could change like categories or they like change
Yeah.
aspects of a prototype.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
To get with this like prototypical thinking, it's kind of interesting when you think about it, like how when somebody is like it's a form of stereotype as well. Like when you think of a stereotype, you're basically prototyping a human being personality and you're basically trying to categorize people in that prototype of what that idea of that thing is. But we all have different prototypes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's kind of narrowing.
Yeah, we all have different prototypes depending on what we pay attention to. I would say my prototypical dog in my head is probably more smaller, and that's because I've grown up with two small
Yeah,
dogs.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Whereas some people's prototypical dog would be huge. Um, and neither's right, neither's wrong because they all fall into that same category. But it's just interesting to think about that.
Yeah,
That,
it
but
is.
if you think about the way most people's like minds are constructed, you have to have this association to like this prototype of what, or the label, and the label has like an image to it to a degree.
And it's so kind of subjective.
God, I mean, I'm gonna have to Google it now just to be sure. Proto.
I had a thought a couple of weeks ago, like in terms of, so yeah, like we categorize things. It's slightly subjective to point, and depending on like what we've been brought up with.
And what you pay attention to also.
Yeah, which means that if every category, let's say, is a spectrum, right? So what looks most like an idea of a dog and what's furthest away, but is still technically a dog. You know, like one of those tiny little like rat chihuahuas versus like like a Great Dane. You
Yeah,
know,
that's a good example.
but what's interesting is that depending on our knowledge and especially our expertise,
Yeah.
then you have a bigger spectrum. So, for instance, I got this thought because I was at work at the restaurant, and someone was like, "Oh, this is really busy." Now, I've been there like a year and a half, and I know it wasn't like, I wouldn't have described it as busy because I've seen it on a busier day. But my experience compared to, let's say, the head chef who's been there 20 years, his busiest day would be like way above mine. So, like, when we describe these things like, oh, this is busy or that's busy, but it's all like subjective, and it's like,
Is your reality, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
And you're comparing it to what your non-busy is. Whereas
Yeah,
you
like,
are always busy, their non-busy is probably like you're busy. Like, yeah,
yeah.
it's all subjective. Like, yeah.
And the expertise is like, they can be slightly more objective because they've been there for 20 years rather than a year and a half,
I think
which I find quite interesting.
because by the way, I think you slightly before you went on to that idea of like busyness, but I feel like this idea of expertise and like, I think, did you say something about having categories that are like different?
Yeah,
I literally was writing this down the other day. So like, is intelligence just a refinement of like the way you categorize things? So for example, like let's say you go into a situation, or maybe not even what you categorize, but what you pay attention to, or what something means to you. It's like somebody who's really good at communication goes into a situation where two people are talking, or like a social situation, right? And because they've learnt the cues, they've learnt more refined ideas about what happens in a conversation, they can pick up on smaller things because they've got a refined category of like,
yeah,
of let's just say they understand a more nuanced area of like emotion. Like they understand that there's a different types of emotion, like uncertainty, etc. Right, and they can sense
yeah,
uncertainty because they look at people's voice tonality, right, and they can pick it out. So my thoughts is like, is intelligence or is like expertise just a refined version of looking at the same thing, but you look for different things, so you're categorizing a situation differently. If you kind of get me,
yeah.
but like a dog expert will know all the different types of dogs. Whereas I see a dog, I'm just like, it's a dog. And I was thinking about this the other day. I was sat outside, and I was looking at plants. Like these are all plants to me, but there's no refinement. But an expert would be able to sit there and be like, that's a different plant, that's a different plant, that's a different plant, that's that plant, that's this plant.
Exactly. Look, you don't have the ability to compare it to anything yet. It's like, what yeah, I'm the same. I don't know really any plants, but you then know what like a daffodil is because everyone knows what a daffodil is, but you don't know what some like intense plant is. So like, I feel like the more nuance and the more experience you have and expertise you have in an area, the more things you have to compare. And once you can compare all of them, you can understand like the kind of concept underlying all of them. Whereas like when you're a novice and you only have one thing, it's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect, they're like, you only have one thing to go off.
Yeah, you haven't seen the sort of complexities in terms of all the different types of plants and all the different ways they interact, right? So you're just completely, your categories, one, aren't refined, and two, you're just completely ignorant to the fact that there's so much out there that you have no fucking clue about. You just think, oh, plant's a plant, fuck it.
It's interesting because you end up like, realistically, a category is a rule, right? Like a rule for the category of a dog is four legs and it's furry and it barks, right? But then like
What about wolf? I guess they howl.
yeah, they
I'm gonna
howl,
say
I guess.
it's like that's what I mean. It's really hard to even create the category. Like I feel like we got very good visual categories. I'd say
Yeah,
that as well, right? Like we can visualize the difference. You can almost see the difference rather than
yeah,
then you make the. Sorry, I'm actually just thinking out loud here. But then you make the point about the Chihuahua and the Dane. So like, there is a visible difference there. That if let's just say you didn't know the label dog, would you be able to discern that the same species? Maybe.
yeah. But that's it, like, look at a donkey and a horse,
True.
or a donkey and a pony. Like, You know, they're pretty similar, but like, you know, it's not until you've really paid attention, and that's kind of it. It's not until you come across this other kind of information that
Ooh,
you put into the equation, which is this category, and then the
mm.
sum changes.
I was about to
You
say,
know?
interesting, literally on the topic of animals, right? Let's just say we didn't know any of this knowledge about what species are. We categorize based on look, so we probably call donkey and a horse very similar. We
Yeah,
might call something different just because they look different. But like it's like the same with dogs; they're all called different names, but the species is actually named based on the genome, isn't it? Or like the
yeah,
similarities in DNA. But like finding the DNA has allowed for this deeper level categorization. If you think about it, that's kind of the
yeah,
point.
yeah,
Like the more you learn, the more proxies you learn for like differentiating. So beforehand, it was like maybe when we first started out as hunter gatherers, you differentiate visually. You'd be like, this one looks like this,
yeah,
this one looks like this. Then you get to know
yeah,
them more. You study their behavior. This one behaves this way. This one behaves that way. Okay, they're slightly
yeah,
different.
yeah, yeah,
And then you slowly refine down to the point now where we've obviously discovered DNA, and now we can refine based on like who has the similar DNA. And then you
yeah.
base like you can then differentiate based on that. And the more I think about it, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Like this idea of refined, but like this links back to the. Sorry, I'm linking this back to the sport thing as well in my head because
Yeah.
it's kind of different, but at the same time, it's like measuring via time, we're refining that down to something specific. You're measuring something different, so you can categorize differently. So the structure is different of what you're looking for, like how you're going to improve. Like it's the same thing. It's like you either
Exactly.
you're just changing the way you're looking at something.
Yeah. No, but that's exactly it. Like, I use this kind of metaphor in terms of like paint or colors. You know, like everyone knows the standard color blue, but then it's not until like, you know, you really start, like you're a painter or something, and you start using different colors that it makes a complete difference, because you're basically just narrowing in. You know, you're constantly narrowing in, and then you can start to see the specific details within each thing, and then you start to see the differences between lots of different things. But if you zoomed out, you'd be like, oh well, all those colors are blue, but they're just
You
variations of blue, you know?
you made a really interesting point about that. I'm just going to just build on that quickly because I recently read the Creativity Inc. By
Yeah,
well, the guy who runs Pixar. First of all, it's fucking amazing. There's so many good like metaphors in there,
yeah.
and like
Ooh.
ways and the way he runs Pixar and sort of the sort of ideas he has organizationally for bringing about creativity is good. But wait, where is it? You just reminded me. So this is it. He talks about one of the important things he teaches all Pixar people is learning how to see. So basically, what they originally do is
Okay.
he talks about how the difference between like basically artists have learned to look at things differently than everybody else. So he
Yeah.
talks about this idea that it's back to this left and right brain thing from the Master and his Emissary. The left, isn't it? The left that's the one that sort of categorizes and sort of comes up with what things are like labeling.
Well, I think the right categorizes, but the left creates
Okay,
the rule.
okay, fine, yeah. So basically, his point is what artists do, or they try and do, is we all have this innate ability to see something and recognize it via this like prototypical memory. Like we recognize
Yeah,
that as
yeah,
a dog,
yeah,
we
yeah,
recognize this is that because we have these concepts saved. He talks about artists. What they try and do is they try and unsee. So instead of looking
yeah,
at something and categorizing that as a book, you try and explore it in its entirety. And you try and
yeah.
look
Okay.
out and just not recognize it as a book and see it for what it is and the colors. It's kind of what you're saying. So instead of seeing like a general plant, you just see like, oh, it's a bloody plant. You try and look at it as entirety, and you try and take in it if it wasn't a plant. If you kind of get me, it's really
Yeah,
weird.
yeah, yeah,
It talks about like basically the way it's taught is this woman comes in and tries to, or this person comes in and tries to teach them how to draw, and in fact, it's not about learning how to draw; it's about learning how to see. And
yeah,
it talks about by changing your focus, you learn how to see and you learn how to draw better because you're focusing something different or something like that. And it was just an interesting point based on this artist thing. How and back on the topic of like this categorization and like it's sometimes good to just withhold that and try and stop yourself and be like, right, that's a dog, just to try and see it for what it is.
yeah. Exactly.
Um,
Look at the detail. You know.
or look at
Um,
it a different way. You might notice something different when you're not like
yeah.
categorizing it in a certain
But
way.
what I find funny is like, if we are going off the idea that that categories are basically rules, then rules kind of like have the connotation that you follow them,
Uh-huh.
and following is like going forward, which kind of means that you're kind of looking for anything that has that basic equation, like four legs, furry, and that's it. You
Yeah.
know, so you'll look at it's kind of like confirmation bias. You're looking for information that can categorize something so that you can kind of highlight anything that's different and be like, fuck, okay, well that dog actually is, you know, fucking massive, and I've never come across a big dog. Is that still a dog?
Mhm.
You know, and that's when you pay attention. So it's kind of like I just find it interesting that like they're kind of just rules that you're constantly looking for.
I get what you mean. But they're also like a rule to make sure you can try and understand everything that's going on.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and these rules, it's quite interesting. It's more as like passed down as culture, right? You learn them through. You don't get born. You get born kind of being able to discern what's a dog and what's not, but you don't have the label until somebody gives it to you. If you get me.
yeah, yeah,
So you're born. You will obviously know what it is. You see it, but you wouldn't even be able to conceptualize it without having this other knowledge that all human knowledge is built off. This idea that
yeah,
we learn the differences um, based on our schooling system, I guess, as well, which is
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. I was literally just about to say something.
I was
Yeah,
about to say another interesting thing on the creativity Inc. Like talked about a lot about Steve Jobs and like how he saw a lot of these rules that we kind of have as society as kind of arbitrary, and that was the reason
yeah,
why it's such like a knob to people. It was more because he was so. I want to say wise. I don't. Maybe it was. He was like into like his Buddhism and stuff, but this ability to like look at stuff and realize that like a lot of the stuff we see and categorize is just basically a rule that we all come up and agreed on, and it's not necessarily the truth. And language isn't actually a model of
well,
reality.
yeah,
It's
because
a way of describing it. If you do want to go really
if
deep into this, it's not actually the truth. It's like a model.
but that's exactly it. It's like it's not like categories, like we just said. You're constantly going further in. You're following this rule, which means you're kind of narrowing in rather than looking at the bigger picture. And I reckon Steve Jobs was someone that could see the bigger picture and be like, "Wait a minute, this rule is kind of bullshit in the grand scheme of things."
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of weird, but like my nephew, he went through this stage of like, if you were like, "Oh, do you want an ice cream?" and he'd be like, "Yes," and then you give him one, and then he doesn't say thank you. So then you're like, "Well, say thank you," and he's like, "But I don't really mean it," and it's kind of weird because it's like
Interesting.
it's not for him, it's for me, but it's like
Uh,
trying to explain why they do it when
I
realistically
I know it's for you, but basically what it is you're trying to teach him, right? And this actually
yeah,
really links into the book I'm reading about at the moment about this whole idea of the origins of virtue and like how we bring about cooperation in society.
yeah,
And it makes sense that so the more I think about it, the thank you is kind of like a way of acknowledging that you've done me a deed.
exactly,
And
exactly,
and basically what you're trying to teach him is so fine, he doesn't back to my point which I was saying to you earlier, mate. Family, you don't really thank your family as you should because you expect it, right? Okay.
yeah,
You're trying to teach him to say thank you. So when somebody else, like a random stranger, gives him it, he says thank you because if he
yeah,
doesn't,
yeah,
he's then going to get labelled as somebody who's not appreciative of a gift, right?
yeah, yeah,
And this is
yeah,
all back to what it is this is this idea that we socialize people so they can deal with other people, and the
yeah,
socialization is more like the tit for tat. Like you do me a favor, I'll definitely acknowledge the fact you've done me a favor, and then I'll either pay you back or I'll just show my gratitude, right? And that's kind of you think about it, that's what you're actually teaching him to do because you're not really scared of him not saying thank you to your family because you know they're going to continue doing the same to look after him. But you're teaching him to say thank you for the people who are basically just doing it because they want to be acknowledged for doing it. If you kind of get
yeah,
me,
yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah.
that's really interesting. I didn't. Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't really. It just really highlights our like rules, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's like, kids are naturally like great kind of philosophers because they ask, well, why is the sky blue? Or why is that blah, blah. These bigger questions that we're not so used to thinking so like broadly. We end up just narrowing on everything that we kind of want to see. So it's interesting when like one of these kind of social rules that we've put in place is suddenly questioned. You're like, fuck, I've never actually stopped to think about that. Like I'm so used to saying like please and thank you that like it's like it's kind of just like a normal thing you do that you don't even think about it anymore. Um,
I think,
yeah, which is
but also, mate, you forget that the rule of thank you is actually more to acknowledge and be polite to somebody because you'd rather be polite because if you're not polite, you are more likely to be socially ostracized. So it's actually
yeah,
a risk.
yeah, yeah,
If you
yeah,
go deep into the evolutionary roots, it's a risk mitigation strategy, which is once you start seeing everything as that, it starts fucking with
yeah.
you. I have to say,
Well, someone is spending effort on you.
yeah. Basically, if you don't say thank you, if you don't show some sort of appreciation, they're less likely to do it again for you because they feel like you've just taken the piss, kind of thing. Even if you're a young child, they still want to expect to see you being polite.
Yeah. Well, someone has spent effort on
Yeah,
you,
no, mate.
and if you don't seem like you're appreciating it, then why would they do it again? Because if we are in like if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective or a survivalist perspective, then why would someone risk their resources for you?
Yeah,
You know?
no, correct. And it's more like it's just, I think it talks about this idea in this book that I was reading about the origins of virtues. Like, if you go in as strategy being polite, you are more likely to get a polite response and therefore build up a cooperative relationship. So if you go in as not being polite, you're less likely to have a reciprocal relationship in the future, like this whole idea of like
Yeah.
cooperation.
Yeah.
It's like the most safe strategy as a human being is always to go in as polite. And then if somebody's nasty to you back, then you then don't be polite. Like the whole point
Yeah.
is like it's like game theory. You basically, by being polite the first time, you gauge whether they're going to be polite with you, and if they are, you can build up a mutually beneficial like relationship. Even as young as a
Yeah.
kid, that's what you're trying to teach them. Because if they go in as rude, people don't like rude people, and they get ostracized more often, right? Um, it's that type of sort of dynamic. That's what I think, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. It's like kind of long-term thinking. Yeah. And did you have any other notes?
To be honest, like kind of off topic, so I could go into some of these. Wait, was it? Yeah, fine. So this is going to be quite a hard one to explain, but I'm going to try and do
Okay.
it justice.
Go.
He talks about, so in Creativity Inc. He's like, this guy's head of Pixar. There's this a bit of background. He goes into stuff later on where he's talking about using mental models to understand, or for his directors to understand or deal with stress and the pressures of doing creative work.
Yeah.
So obviously when you're creating a film, you're kind of like operating with a blank slate. You're creating something new. You don't know if it's like you just don't know if it's going to be successful, do you? Really, obviously, you've got these people building up a film. There's a lot on the line here, and it's quite interesting how he has like a load of different directors who've done different films, right? And they all kind of have the same like mental models for thinking about this creation process.
Yeah.
So one of them thinks of it as a metaphor of digging archaeologically, and they're trying to find the piece of art or the idea that is hidden in sight. So basically, they refine what they're doing, and they're imagining that they're in an archaeological site, digging up the story and digging up the juicy sort of artifacts that are going to create a great story. And then another one was talking about very similar to that. It was like the Michelangelo, sort of got a marble block, you're chipping away to create the statue of David or whatever it is. Is that the name of it?
Yeah.
And then
There's a statue within every block of marble.
yeah, basically that type of thing. And what I found quite interesting about that was this idea that if you have this like guiding principle that what you're doing is like you're searching, you're discovering, you're more likely to continue in the face of adversity. And that's kind of what his point was. So this is quite interesting as well because he doesn't agree with that model. He doesn't agree with the idea that it's there hidden and that you find it. He's more of a person belief that you invent the future. So his mental model was more like you're building it up, like you're building this story and you're refining it as you go. Like I can't remember his exact mental.
As in you're manifesting.
Yeah, you're manifesting it. I would say it's more familiar to like building a pyramid. Block by block, stuff happens, you fix it, and you continue going. Right, that was his mental model. But he says like he never told people how to think because it's not even about how it's not even like an accurate representation, is it? Like you're not actually digging. This is back to the metaphor thing. You're not actually digging archaeologically to find this stuff. But it's what I found really powerful is this idea that it gives your brain a really powerful way of dealing with setbacks because you now understand this whole process as part of it. Like the whole idea, you dig up something and you realize you've been digging in the wrong spot, so you go somewhere else.
Well, yeah.
And this idea that your mental models of understanding a particular process, even if it's a lie, can give you hope and help you understand things or understand the arduous task of doing something that's risky.
Well, yeah, I guess you're kind of painting it in like an exciting, motivating kind of way in terms of like
the success is around the corner. Like it's still there; it can be found.
If you are a pioneer, you're venturing into something where there's the unknown, and like the unknown can be scary, but also exciting. And if you paint it in an exciting way to kind of be like, well, you're an archaeologist, or you're exploring, you're going to find something that no one's found before, that kind of thing, that kind of motivates you to go into that unknown, I guess. You're just kind of reframing your approach to it, because I reckon. Otherwise, and I do agree with this manifestation, actually, this idea that it's not necessarily already there. The answers don't exist until you ask the question, the solution isn't there until you look into the problem.
If you really think about it, your life is one big like sort of archaeological dig and you're just trying to find the meaning, I do like it. And I obviously they're not representative of reality, but I think if they can give you that sort of push, I quite like the idea. I think in principles, Ray Dalio talks about it. Is like, so the way your life kind of works with goals, right? Is you're climbing a mountain, you hit a peak,
Yeah.
and when you hit the peak, you realize there's another mountain. So like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
you're
yeah,
continuously just climbing in a way. And it might sound hopeless, but it's quite interesting that you're having these peaks throughout your life, and that is essentially what your goals are. You're just hitting your targets, and then you're refining. But yeah, no, mate, he had some really good metaphors. I think another one I really liked was this idea. There was a cognitive, no, what was it? It was a clinical psychologist who basically tried to explain to somebody, which I quite liked, this idea of personalities being that to deal with different personalities, like being a manager, it's a bit like taking elevators to different floors of a really tall building, and people
yeah,
live on different floors and have different views, and like that's the way you should look at people's like they just have different views from that building, and I quite like it's very simplistic, but it's a good way of
yeah,
conveying that people have different opinions or people see things differently because they are on different floors.
yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, I've quite gotten into this mental models at the moment. Like, although it could sound quite broad, just this idea of like kind of structures that allow you to think about something in a certain way, like the archaeological like kind of perspective, like you just said. Um, but this course that I've been doing in the Michigan University one, the mental models one, I found it quite interesting in terms of the mental models, the main ones that I use to like explain things. If we're talking about a literal model, is probably spectrums and comparisons. I use those quite a lot because I think you can describe information quite well. But I was just like, I think the more kind of mental models you have, the more ways that they're kind of useless without information. You have to apply information to them, and once you do, you can see things in a much better light. And I'm kind of curious to learn different models in which I can look at something and be like, oh, okay, fuck. So I used to look at I can look at this in a spectrum kind of way, but I can also look at it in this kind of way or that kind of way. Exactly what we were talking about earlier on, like having different views and coming at things in different angles, like measuring things in different ways. These are basically it. These are the models that you can use to be like, okay, I'm going to measure it in this way or that way.
Yeah,
Um,
no,
yeah,
for sure. It's like I don't know if there's still a lag going on, but it's it's for me the ability to look at things in different ways because no one true mental model is correct. It's just like multiple ways of looking at the same thing, or
yeah,
the ability to see, to just structure things differently. You can solve problems by looking at it different ways, right?
yeah,
um on a weird other one, so like for me it's really hard to discern, I guess, between a mental model, which I think is more like a mental model is more, so in fact, interestingly, on one of the books I was reading on design, that little pocket book I had the other day,
mhm,
it talks
yeah,
about there's different types of mental models. Oh fuck, I'm gonna butcher this. One of them is called interaction models. So like the way you
yeah,
interact with something. So like you can figure out how something works as a tool, right? And then I can't remember what the other one's called, but I can only just assume it's like a system model, similar. So not like an interaction, just the way things work. But like a mental model essentially is just like understanding of a particular process of the world, right? In my head.
yeah,
That's what it is.
yeah.
It's like a model of something, the way things work. And then I was thinking, like, isn't a metaphor kind of similar? It's like a structuring of something.
Pretty
So
much.
it's like a
Yeah,
it's like a way of like thinking of something, like it's like a mental model of thinking of something through the lens of something else. If you get me, so it's
yeah,
like
yeah,
it's thinking of the creative process through the lens of doing an archaeological dig site and finding treasure, which I thought was quite interesting. And the whole idea that like by using these different mental models, you are highlighting different aspects of reality. So like by having it as the archaeological site, you are highlighting the fact that it's stressful. There's no guarantee, but when you do find something great, it's going to be great. That kind of thing.
yeah,
But
yeah,
but then you downplay the idea that there might potentially be that you never find it,
yeah.
or is it really? Are you really finding something, or are you really creating something? And that's what aspect are you highlighting, which I thought was quite interesting. Because he talks about, which this is another metaphor I like, which might just sort of hammer home the point. You've heard like the assembly line, the Ford assembly line, and like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and then I think it was Toyota took it a step further, where basically what they did is they had a traditional assembly line where every worker had a cord, right? So if there was a problem, they pulled the cord, everything came to a halt, and everybody would come around and try and figure out what the problem was and how to fix it. So
Oh, that's
the assembly
cool.
line, the assembly line would have like a feedback system where they solved the problem as it went, right? And he talked about this idea of like in Pixar, what they tried to have is the problem assembly line. So not just like, but for information. So like if something was going wrong, because obviously they didn't have a real physical, literal assembly line. They have just obviously the production line, sort of the way it all works, communication. Like the whole idea was you should pull the cord metaphorically, to then get everybody on it to solve the problems as they come, and you
Yeah.
empower the people at the situation to fix them, which I thought was a really interesting way of running a business, and I quite like the
I
method.
think that's such a cool way, actually, because it also incentivizes everyone. Well, it doesn't incentivize, but well, yeah, it does
Take
actually.
responsibility, mate. It incentivizes
Yeah,
people to take responsibility for the problems and solve them, and it's quite fulfilling to like,
but it's also like everyone else knows everyone else's job in a way.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure. But also you get somebody else's outside perspective on fixing your job. So
Exactly.
yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's another great like sort of this sort of the idea of metaphorical like thinking, or the idea of like putting a concept and then trying to think how could I use this concept somewhere else, like
Yeah.
back to what we were saying about the imagination earlier, like this idea, like well, this is how I think Einstein kind of did it. Like he just, he's constantly thinking about the problem, right? But then he would see something
Yeah.
like, hang on a second, like what if that? What like I think the way he thought of like gravity or something about light was just like I can't remember what it was. It was something like what would happen if it was just like a beam of light or something like that. Or he basically reframed it as like a different property, and that's how he figured it out. And it's like that level of like just opening your mind up to like, could it be similar to this? And then just trying to like that's the way I think of your brain when it synthesizes.
Yeah.
It's like taking two things and trying to figure out where the similarities and how you can combine them is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy because like think about how many things that we haven't broken out of yet of thinking in a particular way, and then someone's going to come up and be like, fuck, why didn't we think about it like that? And we'll all be there like, fucking hell yeah, that's so stupid. Like, when you look back, like, when the fucking earth was flat,
Yeah.
and then someone just goes, what would it mean if the world was round?
I still think one of the things I always try and think about to like, I mean, it's not even like humble. It's just to like try and understand the situation we're all in right now. Is this idea that like people still believe complete absurdities. Like if we think as a collective species we've got it all figured out, you are naive as fuck. And like I'm probably wrong about half the things I believe, but at least I'm trying to figure it out. And that's the kind of the way I see it. Like a load of people who like they're so cocksure of everything, and it's just like how can you be like? There's not much you can be sure on. It's just yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Especially when you start seeing. I feel like one of the best things you could ever do to yourself is just read widely. Because for me, it's just like you just start realizing there's so much more to everything than you could ever think of, and it's just like
So many
it's
things link.
humbling, but huh? So do you think?
So many things.
Yeah, of course. Well,
Yeah.
I think stuff like human nature. But I think for example, the things I like to study at the moment are stuff which doesn't change. So this idea like the brain is like a structure. I mean, obviously it's adaptable structure, but we do have innate sort of instincts, and it's like understanding those instincts, seeing how
Yeah.
they sort of come out within culture, stuff like that, which hasn't changed over millennia. So that's where it's good to sort of learn the sort of principles and the stuff which doesn't change.
Yeah.
I think yeah, cool, mate. I think we'll end it there then.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sweet, that's good.
And that's a wrap.
Yeah, perfect.